Hey everyone, and welcome to the first episode of my podcast, the podcast where I review other podcasts. From Joe Rogan's podcast, he told other people to start a podcast. Even I got a podcast. The point of this podcast is to review podcasts. There's this one fucking podcast. Anyone can start a podcast. These podcasts, hopefully this podcast will inspire you to start your own podcast. Podcasting has always been a passion of mine, both as a viewer of podcasts and as a producer of podcasts. This is a podcast for podcasters by a podcaster. The purpose of this podcast is to really just capitalize on other people's success. All my friends have a podcast, and hopefully they can come on this podcast and talk about their podcast, and then I'll go on their podcast and talk about this podcast. Speaking of guests, Mark, who's our guest for next week?
No one knows we're doing this.
Mark, I told you to call my cousin. We're live right now. Can you not do this? Can you not do this?
Well, can you?
Mark, can you not do this? His podcast has over 30 people watching it. But if we could get him on the podcast, do you know that will do for our numbers? Do you know how important podcasts are right now? Podcasts are just as important as Bitcoin, okay?